Hi boys and girls, in this lesson we're going to be going over lesson 14.6, volume of a rectangular prism and liquid. And so what we're going to be talking about is how to find the volume of rectangular prisms. So before we start, I just want to do a quick review of some of the important vocabulary that we need to know when we are calculating the volume of a rectangular prism. So when we take a look at an example of a rectangular prism, like what you see in the picture below, all the faces of a rectangular prism are rectangles. So when we're looking at our rectangular prism, we can see that there would be 6 faces on a rectangular prism. Now we can't see all of them right now because some of them are hidden. But if this prism were see-through, then we would be able to see all 6 faces. So next we're going to talk about length, width, and height, because we need to be able to identify those 3 dimensions when we're looking at rectangular prisms. So when we're talking about the length, we're talking about how long is the side. So this would be the length here, where my red pointer is. And the length in this particular prism would be 22 centimeters. Now the width is how far back or how wide the rectangular prism is. So in this particular prism, the width would be 8 centimeters. And the height is how tall the prism is. So in this particular prism, the height would be 8 centimeters. Next, we're going to be taking a look at a few examples of prisms and identify the length, the width, and the height of each of them. So if we look at number 1, the length, which is how far across it goes, would be 6 centimeters. The width, how wide or how far back it goes, is 4 centimeters. And the height, how tall it is, would be 5 centimeters. When we take a look at number 2 now, the length would be 3 inches, the width would be 3 inches, and the height would be 9 inches. Now when we're thinking about volume, one way that we can think about it is how many centimeter cubes would we be able to fit inside of our 3D shape of our rectangular prism. And so if we look at the rectangular prism that is labeled A, we can see that we have a bunch of cubes that make up that rectangular prism. And we can see that it's all one layer. And so in that one layer, there are 20 1-centimeter cubes. So the volume of A would be 20 cubic centimeters. Now if we were to go and add another layer to what we have in A, then we would be having 2 layers of the cubes, and each layer would be made up of 20 of the cubes, and so we would have twice as many cubes. So 20 plus 20 would equal 40 total cubes. So there would be 41 centimeter cubes that we would be able to fit inside of the rectangular prism B. So the volume of B would be 40 cubic centimeters. When we're thinking about the number of layers that we have, that helps us figure out what our height is. So the number of layers that we would have would be what our height is. Now let's look at another way to visualize the rectangular prism B that we just looked at in the previous example. So when we're thinking about the cubes that we would be able to fit inside of our 3D shape, we can use that to help us identify our length, our width, and our height if we didn't actually take the time to go and put those cubes inside of our rectangular prism. So on the left, if we were to count the number of cubes across, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cubes across. And so that transfers over to our prism on the right, that our length is 5 centimeters. If we were to look at the width on the left, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4 cubes going back. And so our width on the right would be 4 centimeters. And then if we look at our height, we have 2 layers in B, so our height is 2 centimeters. So our 2 prisms are identical, only one shows how you would fit the cubes inside and one doesn't. And so we're going to be taking what we looked at in 14.5 and using that to help us calculate the volume when we aren't counting cubes anymore and we're using more of a formula to help us calculate the volume of a rectangular prism. So if we go back to looking at the volume of one layer, we know that there were 5 cubes across and 4 cubes back, or 5 times 4, which would equal 20 of those cubes for one layer. And we knew that we had 2 layers, so we were taking 2 times the 20 from the first layer, which is the same thing as doing 5 times 4 times 2, and that gets us our 40 centimeter cubes. So put that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about what steps did we just take to figure out what the volume of that shape is, because that will help us when we get to the time of using a formula. So if you remember what we were just multiplying together to calculate the volume in the previous example, we were taking our length times our width times our height to calculate the volume of the rectangular prism. And so the formula that we're going to be using is volume equals length, that's the L, times width, that's the W, times h, which is the height. So you're going to need to be able to identify the length, the width, and the height of a rectangular prism in order to calculate that volume. So now what we're going to do is take that formula and use that to help us calculate the volume of a rectangular prism. So in this example, our length is 15 inches, our width is 8 inches, and our height is 6 inches. So if we remember, we said our formula is volume equals length, and sometimes you'll see length as like a cursive L, so that it doesn't look like a 1, times width times height. So what we're going to do is plug in our values. So we're going to be multiplying 15 times 8 times 6. So we'll start by multiplying 15 times 8. Which is 120, and then now we'll take 120 and multiply that by 6. So I got a value of 720. So our final answer would be that the volume equals 720 cubic inches. So remember, when we're dealing with volume, our units are going to be cubic. And so you can either write out the words cubic inches, or you can use the little 3 up high, and that will signify that it's cubic. Let's take a look at another example. So in this particular rectangular prism, our length is 15 meters, our width is 14 meters, and our height is 9 meters. So if we go back to our formula, the volume equals length times width times height. So if we go and plug those values in, then we're going to be multiplying 15 times 14 times 9. So we'll start by multiplying 15 times 14. And we get 210, and then now we'll take 210 and multiply that by 9. So in total, we got 1,890, and if we add our units to that, it'll be 1,890 cubic meters. So if we take a look at our volume formula again, remember, it was length times width times height. If we look at our length times width for a second, we think back to when we were finding the area of a rectangle, we multiply the length times the width. And so when we take a look at our rectangular prism, what we're really doing when we're calculating the volume is finding the area of our base, one of our faces on our rectangular prism, and then multiplying that by the height. And so another way of thinking about volume is that the volume is really the area of the base, which we're marking as B, times the height. So you can find the area of the base first and then multiply that by the height. So let's take a look at an example of how we would apply that. So if we look at this rectangular prism, it tells us that the area of the base is 98 square centimeters and the height is 3 centimeters. So if we plug that into our formula, we would be multiplying 98 times 3. So we would get a final answer of 294 cubic centimeters.